As economies developed and they began to look for new ways to become more efficient in their production and consumption, trade became a viable option. Now, it started small, and then as our world grew and we became more and more interconnected, trade even between countries became more and more common. And today, it's a massive part of our economic development. Although there are negative side effects to trade, especially internationally, we'll get into some of those later on in the video. Overwhelmingly, economists agree that trade is going to create massive benefits to the economies of all that are involved. In order to examine the benefits of international trade, we're going to actually go back to a model that we've already looked at, the production possibilities curves, and modify it a little bit to work for international trade. If you haven't seen that video yet, I'll put a link at the top. Now, the change that's going to occur for the production possibilities curve when looking at it from a trade perspective is going to be that we're going to have two curves involved, one for each country. But it's still going to be two goods or two products that are being examined.
Go ahead and take a look at an example. This is going to look much the same as it did in a previous video when we looked at production possibilities curves. We have a vertical axis with one good and a horizontal axis with another. Those are both two number lines that are going to represent how many we're able to produce. The difference is going to be in that we're going to have two different countries that we're comparing. In this case, we're going to look at the United States and Canada. The blue line is going to represent the United States, and we're going to show that they're capable of producing 500 cars or 400 units of syrup. And then the line that goes in between them would represent the combinations of the two that they could possibly have. And remember that if they're going to produce more cars, that means they're going to have to give up syrup in order to do that. Now, Canada, represented by the red line, is going to show that they're capable of producing 100 cars or 350 units of syrup, or a combination of the two in between, represented by that red line. Now, this is going to show a couple things for us. First of all, we're going to get into this term absolute advantage. Now, an absolute advantage just means that comparatively, this country is capable of producing more than another. So it's pretty simple. Clearly, the United States has an absolute advantage in car production. They actually also have an absolute advantage in syrup production. Now, this isn't actually accurate based on today's production. Canada produces more syrup than the United States, but I'm kind of making the assumption that if we were to devote our resources to syrup production instead, in reality, we would be able to produce more. That may or probably is not true. Now, we also have to look at another concept called comparative advantage. Comparative advantage is that when you produce a good, you're able to do it more efficiently or at a lower opportunity cost than the other country that you may be trading with. In this case, Canada gives up far less in terms of car production for them to make maple syrup. In order to produce 350 units of syrup, they give up 100 cars in order to do it. However, if the United States were to do the same, and they were to produce 350 units of syrup, they'd have to give up roughly 400 cars in order to do it. So a much higher ratio for the United States. They're giving up a lot more. So let's take this a step further. Assuming that they choose not to trade, they probably would both produce somewhere in the middle. The United States would produce about 200 cars and 250 units of syrup, while Canada would produce 50 cars, 200 units of syrup. The total production, if they were to do that, of both countries combined, would be 700 units, both cars and syrup. Now, if they did decide to trade, though, they're going to decide what they're going to produce based on comparative advantage. The only comparative advantage that exists is Canada with syrup. They're going to focus solely on producing syrup, and then so they would produce 350 units, no cars. The United States will produce only cars then, 500 units, and no syrup. They'll agree on that amount to trade. The US will export some cars, import some syrup. Canada will export some syrup and some cars. What's important here, though, is that the total production when they're doing this is 850 units, which is more than they produce if they were producing on their own.
Now that we've examined the benefits of trade through an economic model, let's take a look at some of the practical arguments against trade that exist in our world. First, I want to take a look at those that are against international trade because of what it can do to domestic production, meaning production that's happening within a certain country. Now, there are obviously going to be companies that are looking for the most efficient way to produce their product to be profitable, and a lot of time that's going to mean cutting costs. So if they can go to a country that has maybe looser employment laws, things that they can get away with lower pay, or different safety conditions they might be able to sidestep a little bit, companies will make that choice occasionally, and they'll save money that way. And often that's going to lead to a company moving its production to a cheaper labor country, whereas the production could have happened and created jobs within the domestic country. Individuals that are known to support laws that would reduce international trade are known as protectionists. They would fight for different ideas like a tariff, which would be a tax on an imported good, something coming in. They might also look towards a quota, which would be limiting the number of a certain product that can be imported within a country, and thus creating more opportunity for domestic producers. The other primary reason against international trade is going to be the humanitarian side of things. These companies that are creating these jobs in these developing nations and exploiting this labor, or at least that's the way it's looked at, are benefiting from these countries that have low wages, potentially dangerous working conditions for their workers, and they're taking advantage of that. As time went on, a fair share of massive tragedies have occurred in these developing nations because of those very reasons. And it's began to question the efficacy of international trade in general. Now, this creates quite the dilemma for us because a lot of people would advocate for eliminating trade with these countries that are being exploited in the first place. The problem is that a lot of times these opportunities for the individual workers are going to be better pay, better working conditions even than what the alternative would be for them. And it also creates this massive growth opportunity for the country itself, but then also those smaller communities. You have these workers now that are getting a paycheck and then providing to their local economy from that income that they're bringing in. Many nations, especially a lot of those in Southwest Asia, I'm talking about Taiwan and South Korea and Vietnam, a lot of these countries were able to get to their level of economic success because of their involvement in trade and being one of those exploited countries early on in their time within international trade. There are several organizations that exist to try to improve the wages, the opportunities, the working conditions for people in these developing nations. The argument can't be to remove international trade completely. Those benefits are clear, but the corporations have to be held accountable for their actions. If they are taking advantage of this cheap labor, they have to be held accountable. What you may not realize is that as a consumer, you have more power than you think. You have the ability to dictate that these companies can't get away with taking advantage of and creating dangerous situations for people in developing nations, and that's by voting with your dollars. What you buy, what you choose to buy is going to be dictating what's acceptable. So if you choose to buy a cheaper option for certain items, think like a piece of clothing or something like that, if you buy something cheaper, you don't know necessarily what conditions went into creating a product that can be produced so cheaply. So you have to consider that, and if you want to look for companies that you feel do the right thing and are supportive of the humanitarian side of things, support them. The consumer market must signal to producers that we value human life over cheap products, and that's the only way we're going to get a change to occur. It can't be through elimination of trade altogether.